Some of the most ambitious people you know get almost nothing done, not because they're undisciplined, not because they don't care. In fact, the research points to something almost backwards. The more vividly they imagine succeeding, the less likely they are to actually do the work. That single finding, replicated across 2 decades of studies, explains the ambitious but lazy paradox better than any amount of moralizing about willpower ever could. Start with the psychologist who discovered it, Gabriele Oettingen at New York University. In the early 2000s, Oettingen ran a series of studies asking people to vividly fantasize about achieving a goal, getting a job, succeeding academically, even recovering from surgery, and then tracked what actually happened afterward. The finding was consistent and, to most people, deeply counterintuitive. The participants who fantasized most positively and most vividly about success put in less effort and achieved worse outcomes than those who fantasized less. In one study, students who imagined getting their dream job in glowing detail were less likely to actually apply for jobs and, months later, more likely to still be unemployed. Here's the mechanism Oettingen proposes, and it comes down to how the brain processes imagined completion. When you vividly picture yourself already having succeeded, already respected, already finished, already thin, already rich, your brain doesn't file that fantasy as motivation. It files it as a preview of a reward that's already, in some limited neurological sense, been tasted. Researchers call this mental attainment, and it produces a small, real dip in the physiological arousal measured through blood pressure that normally accompanies goal pursuit. You relax slightly the same way you would after a real accomplishment, except nothing actually happened. Ambition without friction turns into a kind of daydream that quietly borrows the emotional payoff of achievement without requiring any of the work. This explains something that pure laziness never could. A genuinely unambitious person doesn't spend hours imagining an idealized future self. The ambitious but inactive person does, constantly, in vivid detail, which is exactly why the pattern gets mistaken for drive. It looks like ambition from the outside because it's wearing ambition's clothing. Underneath, the fantasizing is functioning less like a plan and more like a substitute for one. There's a second mechanism that compounds this, and it comes from psychologist Julius Kuhl's research on what he called action versus state orientation. Kuhl found that some people, when facing a difficult or emotionally loaded task, get stuck in a looping, deliberative state, turning a decision over and over in their heads rather than moving into action. This isn't a character flaw so much as a difference in how efficiently someone's brain disengages negative emotion tied to a task. Ambitious people, almost by definition, hold themselves to higher standards, which means the emotional charge attached to starting, and possibly failing, is proportionally larger. Higher ambition can directly produce more state-oriented freezing, not less, because there's simply more emotional weight sitting on top of the first step. Layer on a third finding, this one from procrastination researcher Fuschia Sirois. Sirois's work reframed procrastination entirely, showing it isn't primarily a time management failure. It's an act of short-term mood repair. When a task feels threatening, usually because it's tied to a standard you care about living up to, delaying it produces immediate emotional relief. The irony her research uncovered is brutal. The people most likely to procrastinate on a given task are often the ones who care most about doing it well, because caring is exactly what makes the task emotionally loaded enough to avoid. Low-stakes tasks rarely get procrastinated on. It's the ones bound up with identity and ambition that do. Put these three findings together and the paradox stops looking like a paradox. Vivid, positive fantasizing quietly substitutes for effort by delivering a preview of the reward. High personal standards increase the emotional charge attached to starting, which increases the odds of freezing instead of acting. And procrastination itself is a mood repair reflex that gets triggered hardest by exactly the tasks people care most about. None of these mechanisms require a person to be lazy in any meaningful sense. They require a person to be ambitious enough to fantasize vividly, standard-driven enough to feel the weight of starting, and human enough to reach for short-term emotional relief the same way everyone does. Oettingen's own follow-up research points toward the actual fix, and it's almost anticlimactic in how simple it is. She calls it mental contrasting. Instead of only imagining the successful outcome, you deliberately picture the outcome and then immediately picture the specific obstacle standing between you and it. In her studies, this single addition, contrasting the fantasy with the obstacle, restored the physiological arousal and effort that pure positive fantasizing had suppressed. The dream alone anesthetizes. The dream paired with a named obstacle activates. So if you recognize yourself in this, holding genuinely large ambitions while somehow producing very little movement toward them, the honest diagnosis isn't a character defect. It's a brain that's been running an incomplete algorithm, reward simulation without obstacle acknowledgement. The fix isn't dreaming smaller. It's refusing to let the dream stand alone. Like you were never lazy. You were just finishing the story in your head before you'd started it anywhere else.